I think we're recording now, Jay.
Hey, John.
Well, good Wednesday, Pelham Road. I'm here with my friend Jay Kieve, and Jay is the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of South Carolina's coordinator. So he knows all things related to Baptist, right?
Absolutely.
So he's going to join me today for some conversation about Baptist, because sometimes people come to our worship service and they say, this doesn't feel like a Baptist church. And they say, I don't think you're Baptist enough for me. Well, we're going to try to set the record straight today, aren't we, Jay? All right.
Good.
So I have a question. It really is a question, but there's a little bit of an introduction here at the first, okay? Time is always moving. Sometimes we think the way things are is the way things have always been. Or worse still, the way they will always be. But history and time are fluid, they move. If you were to ask people, what do Baptists stand for? Most people would assume certain possibilities, certain positions today, based on the Baptist folks that they see on nightly news shows being spokespeople, or the Baptist preachers they might follow on Twitter. Further, they could base it on the Baptist church in their neighborhood or the things associated with that particular church. Baptist origins are much different than what is commonly considered Baptist. So in a way, we're going to be busting some Baptist myths here today. Let's begin with women preachers. All right.
Sure.
I want to quote for you. This is a quote from the Baptist Faith and Message, the 2000 version. Okay, now this is not our document. We admittedly, the two of us, are members of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. But this is the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest body, a historic body of Baptists. So they have a larger voice in the public arena than maybe they're warranted. But anyway, this is their voice in 2000. This is the Baptist Faith and Message of 2000, which they still adhere to as a doctrinal statement. Well, they're not a creedal people even, so it's not really a doctrinal statement, but it is a guiding document. Is that the best way to put that?
It is often used as a measure of agreement.
There you go.
So, cooperating churches with Southern Baptists tend to agree with most of the things in the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And if they don't, they're often politely asked to not cooperate any longer.
Oh, they're a litmus test.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a boundary.
Boundary, okay.
A circumscription of some kind. Yeah.
Well, here is their quote concerning this subject. It's the church's scriptural officers are pastors and deacons. While both men and women are gifted for service in the church, the office of pastor is limited to men as qualified by Scripture. Jay, is that the way it's always been?
I don't think so. We know the names of some very influential women who were Baptist preachers, primarily, particularly in the colonial and immediate post-colonial early United States era. Very influential preachers who also pastored, who occupied the sort of authoritative seat in their congregations as we traditionally sort of think of a pastorate. Now, it's important to remember that what the pastor's role and job looks like has changed a lot over time. Like most of the early pastors also had other jobs, that it wasn't a profession, particularly in most Baptist churches and most Baptist churches in the South. There were a handful. But for most, it was not a profession. We can talk a little bit about some of the differences that led to that. But we definitely know the names of some very influential Baptist women leaders, preachers, and pastors from early in American Baptist life. So Baptist Women in Ministry a decade or so ago sort of commemorated a month of preaching, inviting churches to invite women to fill their pulpits. And they named that sort of month of preaching after a woman named Martha Stearns Marshall. And so let's talk about her to begin with, because she was so influential. So she was born in 1726, lived 50 odd years, so accomplished a lot in her 50 odd years. She and her husband, Daniel Marshall, were sort of converted to Christianity in the First Great Awakening. So they lived in New England. George Whitefield came through. He was a Methodist pastor, preacher, revivalist, really sort of a leading voice of what's called the First Great Awakening. So this big revival movement that swept through the colonies. And it was a sort of personal conversion message that they responded to. And they responded with great fervor. They became Congregationalists to begin with, but moved with her brother, Shubal Stearns, to Virginia, where they were introduced to Baptist beliefs and converted. And Shubal began pastoring a church there with her husband, Daniel. And the historical records record that she preached in those churches alongside both her husband, Daniel, and her brother, Shubal. The reason this trio is so important is because they moved from Virginia down to North Carolina to a place called Sandy Creek and established a small congregation in Sandy Creek, North Carolina. It's not too far from Pinehurst, I think, kind of in the middle of the state. And Shubal was the pastor. Martha preached a lot. Daniel preached. A few years later, Daniel started another church just outside of Sandy Creek where Martha also preached there. But this little church at Sandy Creek became sort of the mother church, so to speak, of, oh my goodness, hundreds of Baptist congregations across North Carolina and the whole American South. It sort of launched the missionary movement among the frontier Baptists. And so people were converted in the Sandy Creek church, and it grew to 150 or 200 people, and they sent folks out to start churches. And those churches sent folks out to start churches. And pretty soon, there was a large movement on the sort of North Carolina frontier and moving westward of Baptist churches sort of out of that tradition. And Martha was an important preaching part of that. She and Daniel later left and moved and came through South Carolina and preached in South Carolina, and then went and established a church in Georgia, not far from Augusta, where she was actually named one of the pastors of that church. She along with her brother, Relay, bear a lot of responsibility for the whole reason that Baptists have such a large presence in the American South. And her preaching, people describing it in newspapers and in other historical records, documents from the churches, her preaching was fundamental to that success and spread.
And just to remind everybody, because I think Jay and I would love for this to become something that you as the listener say, well, that's new to me. All right, go Google it. All right.
Yeah.
Say her name again and say the time period.
Okay. Martha Stearns, Stearns Marshall. Her brother is Shubal, Shubal Stearns. She was born 1726 and died in 1771.
Okay. Now, kind of keep this in mind that if you're listening to this, that in the third or fourth week of your introduction to Baptist history class, you're going to be taken down a path that says that there were two traditions in Baptist life. One was called the Charleston tradition, and the other,
Sandy Creek.
The Sandy Creek tradition.
Yep.
And those are two large streams that feed into Baptist life. Well, do you want to talk about, we've got a little time here. Do you want to talk about Addy Davis at all?
Well, sure. Addy Davis was probably the first Southern Baptist woman ordained to pastoral ministry intending to pastor a church.
Now, and
So,
say that loudly again. It's not Cooperative Baptist.
no,
The folks that I just read this document from a moment ago, this is those folks.
that's right. Addy Davis, she lived in North Carolina in a Southern Baptist family. She felt called to preach as a teenager in the Baptist church. She went to Mars Hill College in outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and was headed to seminary, but sort of got sidetracked because of some family responsibilities. So she went and worked in the family business for a while, but never relinquished that call to pastor a church. And so in 1963, she went to Southeastern Seminary, which was fairly young at the time. Southeastern started about 1955 or 6, and enrolled there, was welcomed into classes. There weren't a whole lot of women on campus. She probably would have been the only one sort of in that pastoral ministry track. And recognizing that she needed the support and endorsement of the church, joined Watt Street Baptist Church in Durham, who licensed her in 1963 to preach, which in old-timey Baptist life was sort of the first step toward ordination. So somebody would present themselves as having this call to ministry, and a church would say, "We see gifts in you, so we're going to license you," which meant, we're giving you permission to test this call, and we're going to walk alongside you and give you some opportunities to lead. And so she did that at Watt Street for a while. By the time she graduated from Southeastern in 64 or 65, she recognized there were not Southern Baptist churches, pulpits that were open to women. So she struggled to find a place of calling. She reached out to a college friend who was an American Baptist up in Vermont, who recommended her to the First Baptist Church in Reedsboro, Vermont, to be their pastor. And so interviewed there, and in 1964 or 5, accepted that call to be their pastor, but was ordained by the church that licensed her, Watt Street Baptist Church, which continued to be a Southern Baptist church. And so she was probably the first Southern Baptist woman ordained to fill a pastoral role in the traditional way that we would think of it now, right?
And just bear in mind, I know the sun's now hitting me a different way, but bear in mind, 1965, our congregation, we've had 2 Southeastern graduates, and they would have, Spencer LeGrand would have been, maybe his son is listening to this. I don't remember if Spencer would have been prior to 65 or a little bit after 65. And then James Hartley also, I believe he went to Watt Street in Durham, and he would have, I think it was 69 or 70 is when he finished up there. All right. So does Scripture limit the role of pastoring to men?
I don't believe so. Right? I mean, so there's some instructions in First Timothy and places where church roles are described, and typically that is masculine language, and it's the same kinds of things for deacons. The husband of one wife. Well, that could mean a lot of things in the biblical age. It could have meant, married to one person at a time, because plural marriage was a thing. And so some people interpret that as a limitation rather than just as a description of what was going on in the particular church of that letter. What we see elsewhere in Acts, in Romans, and some of the other Pauline epistles is people who are named as preachers, prophets, leaders, folks like Junia and Phoebe, and there's several others who seem to fill a church leadership role that could be akin to being a pastor, right? So, I can see why people see that as a limitation, but I don't think that it is necessary to see it as a limitation, limit it only to men.
If people want to use the Bible to narrowly define things, they can do that.
Well, yeah, for sure. And ironically, or maybe beautifully, some of the early Baptist churches and early churches in the Great Awakening, many of them had female preachers who were important parts, not just Baptists. There were lots of Methodist women, there were lots of Pentecostal women preachers, there were lots of Congregationalist women preachers. And part of the reason it was accepted in a time where, men still had the predominant roles in society, women couldn't own property, there was no voting then. Part of the reason they accepted women preachers was because of what they read in the Bible. So they read in Joel and quoted again in Acts that your daughters shall prophesy, right? And so they read that and saw the women preachers as an indication that Christ would return soon. And so they celebrated it for biblical reasons rather than trying to limit it for biblical reasons.
That's exactly right. And I think it's like Acts 21. There's a Philip, I think, had 4 daughters. His 4 daughters become prophetess.
Yep.
And so the Bible is full of women who have that role. And I'm glad I'm a part of a tradition that affirms that. One of the sayings that I don't know, I doubt that it's original to me. I probably stole it from somebody else, but it goes this way. We ordain women because we baptize girls.
Yeah. The first person I heard say that was Chuck Poole.
Really?
Well,
Chuck probably said it way before me. But the point being that is if God, and you would think redeeming the person is the more difficult of the two tasks.
For sure.
You would think, so surely if God can redeem you,
for sure,
then God can find some way to plug you in and use you in his work.
I think there's plenty of evidence among the guys for that as well. Yeah.
Well, let me move on to another question. I think we've got time. Yeah, if we do this right. Now, I'm going to ask the question, then I'm going to do my rant, and then I'm going to step aside and let you set everybody straight.
All
okay?
Right. That's fair.
Are Baptist churches evangelical churches? Are Baptist churches evangelical churches? Now, I take complete responsibility for the next paragraph or two. Jay has nothing to do with it. At first, there was an early church, a loose, often contradictory bunch of enthusiastic followers of the way of Jesus. By the 300s, this bunch got rounded up and organized by Constantine. Constantine tied the cross to the sword and conquered the world and imprisoned the church, in my opinion. And shortly, Catholicism was born. And shortly after that, it divided between Western Catholicism, Rome, and Eastern Orthodox. And each of them, in their own way, was running from their history of being a lapdog to rulers. In the 1500s, when we finally actually had scripture, printed, holding our hands, there was a break from the Roman Catholic Church, which turns out was good for Rome and good for everybody else. And born from that was the Lutheran Church. And in no time, you had Mennonites and Calvinists and Baptists, in addition to the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. These non-Catholic churches were given the name Protestants, which has come to mean churches separated from Catholic and in principle Reformed. In time, the Catholics had a falling out with the Crown in the United Kingdom, and the Commonwealth started its own church called the Anglican Church or Episcopalians. And the Episcopalians later had a division and they became the Methodists. And by the time all of this hopped over the pond and got to America, they had truly evolved. I think we can safely say that Protestants are very much a part of the fabric of America. Maryland was highly Catholic, Virginia was highly Anglican, yet Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and Lutherans and even Jews were scattered across the other 13 colonies. But today, I don't hear much about Protestants. I just don't. Instead, I hear evangelical a lot in the news. It's like there are only two churches, the Catholic and the evangelical. What happened to Protestants? Or better yet, just go back to my first question. What does it mean to be evangelical, and are Baptists really evangelical? You're up.
Well, the answer is yes and no. Some Baptists are evangelical and some are not. So, we kind of started talking about the women who were converted as a part of the First Great Awakening and the preaching that came out of that. Well, the roots of evangelicalism in the United States are also in the First Great Awakening. So the revivalism, the experientialism, the emphasis on a personal conversion, on personal piety, not just participating in the congregation, but a personal piety that is related, connects you directly to God, and sort of shifted out of Puritanism. The folks converted by the First Great Awakening also took up some of the pietistic code morality as well. So, they became the temperance folks and folks like that. So the roots of evangelicalism, what we consider modern evangelicalism, come out of that movement, right? So the things that characterize traditional evangelicalism, I would say are, a commitment to biblical authority that doesn't have to be inerrantist. Some of it is, but doesn't have to be. But a high view of biblical authority, emphasis on personal conversion, emotional experiences as a part of religion, a moralism that is associated with faith. That's sort of a traditional American moralism, right? Don't drink, don't smoke, don't dance, don't play cards. But those things traveled pretty closely with evangelicals through the years. Now, in the South, the evangelicalism that came to characterize Southern Baptist life, I mean, the Civil War divided Baptist North and South, and they sort of evolved separately after that. And in the South, great historian of Southern religion, Sam Hill, said that the South was pervaded by, this is the quote, a peculiar variety of evangelical Protestantism, which hasn't flourished anywhere else in Christendom over a long period, right? Like it's a unique case study. So yeah. Evangelicalism that there were evangelical movements in the world that flared up but burned out, but what's persisted in the American South has been a very peculiar one. So it's revivalistic, right? The altar call characterizes most Baptist worship in the South. The focus, the climax of the worship service is the call, the invitation. It is a moralism associated with it, right? So again, the don't drink, don't smoke, don't dance, don't play cards. These are things we grew up hearing in Baptist churches. But it's an interesting kind of moralism because there's a giant exception in it to racism and white supremacy, right? Yeah. Dancing is terrible, but lynching, right? Dancing, playing cards on Saturday night is horrible, but segregated lunch counters, that's fine, right? So the moralism has a giant asterisk beside it. Mm-hmm. And it's also characterizing evangelicalism, particularly in the 20th century American South, is a sort of anti-intellectualism and an anti-Darwinism, right? There's a reason the Scopes monkey trial was in Tennessee, right, and not in New York.
Right.
So those things kind of characterize the evangelical movement in the South. So to the extent that Baptists kind of match up and sync up with that, yes, Baptists are evangelical, but there is an influence of the broader, what's called mainline Protestantism, that's also been a part of Baptist life for the whole time. You mentioned the Charleston tradition that, so the Sandy Creek tradition was this revivalist frontier movement. It was, somebody is called to preach, they are plucked from the field and put in the pulpit, right? But in the Charleston tradition, it was an educated clergy. They were prepared for ministry in university. It was folks from the Charleston tradition who founded Southern Seminary, who founded Furman University, who invested in a professionalism for clergy, right? So not all of it has been anti-intellectual, but there's always been this sort of competing for sort of control of the heart of Baptists in relation to that sort of, and then particularly in the 20th century. So you can't really talk about the Baptist life, without sort of thinking about how modernist movements have impacted and shaped what Baptists became in the South and Southern Baptists became. So you mentioned the Baptist Faith and Message. Well, it was written first in 1925 as an sort of an anti-modernist, anti-Darwinism, hedge this growing scientific approach to life and scripture for our churches, right? And each time it's been updated, it's been in relation to sort of either social progress or scientific progress that challenges the authority of scripture. And so it updated in 63, updated again in 98, and then 2000, each in relation to some controversies that sort of come from a more modern, socially progressive perspective. Yeah, that's way more than you asked, but.
Well, it's a complicated issue. Your answer is well formed. I mean, it's yes and no.
Right.
There probably should be a checklist of 5 or 7 things that you can say, well, if you do this, then you're evangelical. If you don't do this, you're not evangelical.
Yeah.
And yet you could still be Baptist inside of that circle, I suppose.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm sort of fond of another word. I'm fond of a word called ecumenical.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we'll have time to cover that in our next time together, because I think we're going to do this again.
Sure.
We ran out of time today. And if I had used the time a little better, I'd have a couple of questions here to craft at the end to hone in on evangelical a bit more. Because evangelical may have been a fine, easily defined word 40 years ago. But now it has been co-opted and corrupted, and now has, in many people's minds, more of a political connotation than it does a religious connotation.
Yes.
I see interviews sometimes with people who, when they're asked, are they evangelical, they name off the top 3 or 4 political positions, which align with a certain group of people.
Yeah.
And then the person who's asking the question says, well, tell me, do you believe that you need to have a personal moment in your life where you turn towards God and follow Jesus? And they look at him like he has 3 heads. Like conversionism has never even crossed their mind that they need to be converted. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Well, you say absolutely, but to me and you, that we understand that, yes, those people are out there, but no, that does not make sense.
Well, yeah. So you and I talked a little about this before, but Protestant was an adjective before it became a noun, right? It described the people who were protesting against the Church of England, against the Catholic Church, Catholic Church first, then Church of England. Protestant became a noun, right? As people began to identify as Protestant, right? Mm-hmm. It started as an adjective. Evangelical is exactly the same way. It started as an adjective, but by the early 20th century had become a noun, and by the mid 20th century had become an association, the National Association of Evangelicals, right? They have a magazine and everything, right? So people can identify with the noun without necessarily going through the things that the adjectives describe.
That's right. Well, I am going to have to cut this off because Zoom is about to tell me we're going to be expiring here. So
we'll do fundamentalists next time.
Well, we got a lot to cover. I want to do ecumenical, I want to do fundamental, and I really do want to talk about race relations in regard to Baptist and how that has evolved. All right, so Jay, I'm going to cut off the recording now, but if you'll hang on just a second, I got one other matter to deal with you on. But everybody else, thank you for dropping by.
Thank y'all.
Bye.